The ability to answer questions is the greatest resource in learning the truth. Carl Jung. You are listening to the Become Your Own Boss podcast. I'm your host, Monica Allen, and you are listening to my third segment of Boss Up Books. This month's Boss Up Books segment is Ask for More, 10 Questions to Negotiate Anything by Alexandra Carter. Alexandra is a law professor and director of the Columbia Law School Mediation Clinic. I love this book because she gives us guidance on how to mediate our own life circumstances, whether it is negotiating with a contractor, a rival, or our spouse. She gives us 10 questions that we need to ask before we get started. And what's counterintuitive is that we start by asking questions of ourselves first. She calls these 5 questions the mirror. Sensibly asking ourselves 5 questions first so we know exactly what we want before we go into any negotiation. It is kind of hard to think of every life circumstance as a negotiation, but if you pull back the layers of the onion, it really is. If you're trying to resolve a sensitive issue in your marriage or in a friendship, knowing where you stand first in the situation can be crucial. I had never really given this much thought in the past. I think we often just vomit out our list of statements, feelings, and demands, especially if we're upset or frustrated. Sometimes not communicating clearly and concisely. Again, Alexandra calls part 1 of her book The Mirror. This is where we reflect on us. I will share with you the 5 questions in the mirror section, but you really need to pick up this book to dig deeper into all of the detail that Alexandra shares with us. The first question is, what is the problem I want to solve? Sometimes the real problem resides underneath what we think we initially are trying to solve, what we initially think the problem is. The second question is, what do I need? Alexandra encourages us to take 5 minutes to write our needs down. My favorite part here is no self-censorship. She tells us to write it down, even if we only think it for a second. The third question, what do I feel? Now we know the F word can be off-putting. I can remember the first few years of Ethan and I being in business together, I would often say, I feel whatever. I feel such and such when we weren't in agreement. And he would say, it is not about feeling, it is about business, which we had to just agree to disagree because feelings are part of each and every one of us. I do think it's easier for some people to suppress their feelings than others, but asking yourself what you feel is important. And Alexandra gives us permission to do that. Number 4, how have I handled this successfully in the past? This question to me can give you confidence because you can usually find some correlation to something you have been successful in the past, though it might not be the exact same circumstance. And her 5th question is, what's the first step? So what's that first step that we need to take after we've gathered this information? Alexandra calls the next section the window. We want to look inside the other person's house, the person we're negotiating with. We do this by asking them 5 questions, 5 questions that will give us insight into them, their needs and concerns. As we enter this section, Alexandra shares a quote by Ernest Hemingway. And his quote says, when people talk, listen completely. Most people never listen. We're all guilty of this, listening to respond instead of listening to understand and empathize. Here are the next 5 questions as we look through the window. Number 1, tell me. Not really a question, but quite an open-ended statement. I have started using this with my family as of late, as Alexandra suggests. Rather than asking Ethan or the kids, how was your day? I ask them, tell me about your day. This leaves it open-ended and not just an opportunity to say, it was good. My favorite part here, we're going to talk about in a little bit, but she calls it land your plane. Number 2, what do you need? Not only does this really open up dialogue, but this will give you so much insight to the person across the table from you. What is it that they are looking for or need out of this situation? Third question, what are your concerns? This is an amazing question because what concerns me may be very different from what concerns the person sitting across from me, but I may inherently think our concerns are the same, and they probably aren't. The fourth question, how have you handled this successfully in the past? So you're posing that question to the person sitting across from you. And the fifth question, what's the first step? So in their mind, what's the first step? If you're in community with other humans, which most of us are, I strongly suggest you read this book. I'm giving you a very, very brief look into the book, but Alexandra goes on to give you examples and more in-depth insight into each question. In addition, she tells you how to proceed once you have all of the answers to the questions from yourself, as well as the questions from the person you're negotiating with. I rarely write or highlight in books because I like them to stay pretty pristine. I don't even like my pages to get bent, but this was one that I could not help myself. I underlined, I made notes in the margins, and even discussed for a bit in a book club. My top 3 takeaways from this book, outside of the questions to ask myself and to ask others, is 1, cast a net and not a fishing pole. You do this by asking open-ended questions. I definitely use this when it comes to interviewing people. I learned this many years ago. To really get to know a candidate better, you want to ask open-ended questions so they can talk more. But in this book, this should be the case in almost every conversation we have. So you ask a question, it's open-ended, and the person has an opportunity to talk. The second part to this is land your plane. I think most of us are probably guilty of asking 2 or 3 questions kind of back to back and landing on a closed question. However, Alexandra teaches us to ask an open-ended question and shut up, be silent. Though it may be uncomfortable. For some reason, silence makes us uncomfortable. But she calls this land your plane, and I absolutely love this. And thirdly, do not censor yourself. So in asking these questions, she wants us to be open and honest in our answers, even if they seem selfish or ridiculous. She encourages us to write them down anyway. We can self-censor ourselves in our businesses and in our personal lives. Before we even give an idea a good look or a good go, we've pushed it aside as nonsense or too hard or unrealistic. So let's not self-censor. Ask for More, 10 Questions to Negotiate Anything by Alexandra Carter is available in hard copy, paperback, and audiobook. You can see the link in my show notes to order your copy today. Thanks for joining me for this Boss Up Books episode. Happy reading.